On Easter Friday, 1144, the body of a boy was found in Thorpe Wood, just outside the city of Norwich. Henry, a man from the village of Sprouston, just 2 miles beyond the city, had stumbled across the body in its shallow grave. He noticed it was a boy wounded all over, but being in haste to get to Norwich for Easter confession and the other celebrations, he covered it and left it until a later time. And good to his word, he returned on Easter Monday with the priest of his own village, of his own parish church, and with his family. It was decided on that occasion actually not to take the boy for burial in his village in Sprouston, but rather to involve the Bishop of Norwich in the affair. And that is just to show you, well, I think it's fairly clear, but particularly if you look on the right-hand part of the map, you will see that the cathedral is to the east, it's on the right-hand side, and then the River Wensum. So the Thorpe Wood is just to the right of that. So it's outside the city, it's a sort of waste and wild sort of place. So our text, which I will introduce in a minute, says that this is the, our author tells us, but I think it should not remain unsaid that while he, William, that is the little boy, was carried in the hands of those burying him, immediately such a sweet fragrance infused the noses of those present, as if an abundance of herbs and fragrant flowers grew there. Nor do I think that this came to pass without divine will, so that it might happen that he be buried there, and then be transferred later from there for the sake of greater veneration. News of the discovery soon spread in the city. A married priest called Godwin identified the boy as his lost nephew, William, a 12-year-old apprentice skinner who had gone missing during Holy Week. The boy was carried to the city, where the uncle made a plea before the Easter Synod, the habitual gathering during Easter of the clergy of the diocese and various dignitaries around the bishop. And the complaint was brought to the bishop that the boy has been found and there's reason to think that he had been killed by Jews. A visiting ecclesiastical dignitary, actually who came from an abbey in Sussex, was particularly enthusiastic about the possibility that maybe there was a boy martyr here because his own monastery had been dedicated to its St. Pancras and Lewis in Sussex, to that Roman boy, St. Pancras. The bishop acted properly by summoning the sheriff, the royal official charged with all issues related to the Jews, as sheriffs were, to answer for their alleged guilt. The sheriff appeared and denied any truth to the accusation, both in terms of Jewish motivations, why would they want to do it, and in terms of the available evidence. There was none, and he was the top legal official of the county. There was no legal basis for a case to be brought against the Jews, so he dismissed the issue. Still, for good measure, he housed the Norwich Jews in his headquarters, Norwich Castle, for their own protection. And our author, who will be introduced in a minute, claims that he did so because the Jews had actually bribed him with 100 marks of silver. So you may wonder how indeed I know so much about the affair, how we know about the affair. Our sole source is a work authored by a monk who had joined Norwich Cathedral Priory around 1150, so that is 6 years after the events I've just recounted. This was Thomas of Monmouth. And here is the problem. Almost everything we know about the events of 1144 surrounding the boy's possible death and the accusation of the Jews, which led to the invention, finally, of an infamous and enduring anti-Jewish narrative, is made available to us through the survival of a sole manuscript, Cambridge University Library, edition 3037. And here is its title page. Incipit. Oh, sorry, that's just to show you the cathedral there. Incipit. This is the prologue, Prologus de Vita et Passione Sancti Wilhelmi Martyris Norwicensis. I'm reading that at the top left, the red lettering, which is slightly nibbled away over there. And meaning this here begins the prologue to the life and passion. The passion means the death through suffering, in this case death like Christ's own, of St. William the Martyr of Norwich. The work, which you see here, is 77 folios long, and it told in 44,500 Latin words the story that we will investigate here. What you see here is a copy made around 1200, which I've been able to show had been made in Sibton Priory in the county of Suffolk, to which I shall return. Its author called the work a vita et passio, as we see, a life and passion, that is, an account of a life unto its death, a very special death, like Christ's own and that of his martyrs. But it also includes sections we may call polemical, and some 2/3 of its contents are actually just an account of one miracle after another, miracles that occurred once a cult had developed around the boy's remains. It was fortuitous that a leading expert in medieval manuscripts and a prolific ghost story writer, M.R. James, that's my edition of it, just so you know, was working in Cambridge in 1891 when the manuscript was, when he was summoned actually to a parish in Suffolk to examine a pile of manuscripts that were just mouldering away in the cupboard there. James immediately identified, well, there were a few other very precious manuscripts, but he also identified that this must be the long lost but known about text about the life of the boy William. The reason he knew that such a thing existed is because there had been extracts and little sort of miscellanies and compendia about lives of saints in England in the late Middle Ages that had extracted from some source about, like this, in later centuries, but the full text was not known. So the excitement is absolutely palpable as one reads the correspondence between M.R. James and the man he had chose as his co-worker, collaborator, a retired clergyman from Norfolk, who was a retired clergyman and retired school teacher from Norfolk, who was now in retirement, just doing a whole lot of writing on local history, Augustus Jessup. And these were both scholars very interested, real experts of the Middle Ages and its history. In the case of M.R. James, a very distinguished now keeper of manuscripts at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, in mid-career, so sort of younger than Jessup, and that's important. These two Victorian gentlemen were really excited by the find. Literally, M.R. James put it in a bag and went up to see Jessup in Norfolk and show it to him. Their position was a mixture, as it arises from the letters, of thrill and distaste, since they also distanced themselves from the accusation and the cult that followed. It's quite interesting to see these two Anglican gentlemen sort of talking about those medieval prejudices. That is in the past, in the pre-Protestant past, pre-Anglican past of England. So they were able, their interest was that of scholars, and they did not think that in any way they were implicated by the traditions that were thus expressed. Even more so, I mean, throughout the correspondence which tracks their collaboration in working on the publication of this text, which you see there on the left, you see the title page of the publication that came, when it finally appeared in 1896. Along the way, as they write to each other, and it's usually like 3 letters from Jessup for 1 letter back from M.R. James, he often will say, "Oh, what a scoundrel this monk is," or "what a blackguard Thomas is." I mean, developed quite a relationship with this writer as he translated his work. But above all, they were very, very keen that it be they who edit and publish this text rather than those they call the Romanists. That is, that Catholics should not get their hands on the text. It's quite interesting also to see, as one is exploring this text, which is so important for the history of attitudes to Jews, also to see a sort of little internal Christian polemic unfolding. So the Vita et Passio offers us glimpses and opportunities for historical analysis of how a novel story was confected and made compelling, how fake news becomes the news and hardens into common tradition. And just as the great Italian author Elena Ferrante has put it, there is no work of literature that is not the fruit of tradition, so it is here. Thomas of Monmouth's novel Accusation combined elements of the crucifixion narrative with commonplaces of popular literature and the vivid places and faces of mid-12th century Norwich. Thomas of Monmouth composed an accusation against local people, neighbours, Jewish neighbours, which many could believe as fact, although it was in fact fake. And in order to add authority to his tale, Thomas of Monmouth even recounts what detractors of his tale and his initiative were saying around Norwich, only better sort of to have the occasion to actually rebut and dismiss such objections. So the Life and Passion offers two intertwined narratives. One about the alleged crime committed by the Jews of Norwich, neglected in 1144, only now to be vindicated by Thomas in 1150. Yet alongside this compelling narrative there is another one, of Thomas's own agency as the champion of the boy William. He, a monk engaged in polemic against the complacency, the indifference, and the even outright corruption which had led people to neglect the boy's memory and to leave the Jews unpunished, as we saw in the case of his accusation against the sheriff. Thomas of Monmouth, a new arrival to the cathedral, probably from South Wales, presents himself as a detective re-examining a cold case. Arriving in 1150 and clearly hearing rumours of the events of 1144, seeing the boy was buried in the monks' cemetery, which is just there, if you see there, the cathedral church. So the top is the east, and to the right, if you see, it says monks' cemetery. That's where the bishop, although the bishop didn't pursue the case in 1144, he nonetheless allowed the family that was really pressing him to bury their boy in this somewhat special place. So Thomas did what cold case investigators do. He visited the site of the crime, he re-interviewed witnesses, and even discovered new witnesses that hadn't come forth before. Above all, he aimed to construct a forensic trail whereby a 12-year-old Skinner's apprentice was killed by the Jews of Norwich. But even as he did so, he was conducting a polemic with others closer to him, indeed members of his own community, monks who were doubtful about his claims. Never heard before that Jews conspired to kill a boy at Easter. The text, which has always been studied as the epitome of Christian hostility to Jews, is as revealing when read as testimony about how Christians handled a new narrative about Jews. Bishop and monks of the cathedral were torn over the possibility of the holy erupting in this manner in their midst through the killing of a boy. Those monks who doubted the appropriateness of the new cult were treated to Thomas's vindictive polemic, just as the Jews were. Thomas's narrative stalks the Christian story at several points of his own work. The boy William's mother experienced a vision which foretold his birth. Like Hannah, Samuel's mother, or Mary, mother of Jesus, the birth of her son was foretold. She had a vision, his mother had a vision, which she shared with her father, a man famous for his power in interpreting dreams. And he explained to her after she saw, she had a dream that she was walking on a path, and on the path she came across this fish, a fish that looks like a perch, and the fish had bloody streaks on it, and the fish all of a sudden just arose and entered into her clothing and flew out from her sleeve. And then she woke up and she goes to her dad, what is this? And he says, you know indeed, dearest daughter, that you are pregnant, and so rejoice and joy, because you will indeed be giving birth to a son who will be accompanied by the highest honor on earth and will be raised to the height of the clouds, greatly exalted in heaven. Know also that when the boy is 12 years old, he will ascend to the pinnacle of his greatest glory. So the birth is likened to that of Jesus, the fulfillment of prophecy. And the boy was born on the purification of the Virgin Mary, which is 2nd February, another very important date, in a modest household of Anglo-Saxon folk, and we know that because his parents have Anglo-Saxon names, albeit maybe on the way up because they gave their boys Norman names, William and Robert. At his weaning ceremony, William first fulfilled the promise of the dream prophecy. This family ritual involved feasting and charitable hospitality in thanks for the fact that the child had survived and had reached the stage of weaning, and this included eating but also giving food away. And we are told that amongst the charitable recipients was one penitent who was circumnavigating the land in chains, in penitential iron chains, and depending on begging for his livelihood. The boy acted here his first miracle. For on the day of his weaning, when his father Wenston joyously offered food to the relatives invited to the feast, a certain penitent, his arms in iron chains, entered, as if to beg for alms from those at table. After having eaten and delighted in his food, he took the little boy into his arms as if to admire him, and the boy, in his childish innocence, fascinated by the iron chains, touched them with his little palms, and the chains suddenly cracked and broke into parts. Those dining were stunned at seeing this, and amazed at these wonderful ways, and they ascribed what had happened to the boy's merits. And so the penitent, having been freed by divine grace, went away overflowing with thanks, and the said priest, who was among the assembled guests, collected the broken chains and deposited them on display in the church in Haringland. Haringland is only about 8 miles from Norwich, and in fact there's an antiquarian account that says that in the 18th century still there was on display a pair of chains of this type. Embedded in the rural household, artfully invoked here, the boy showed precocious interest in learning and religion. At the age of 8, he was sent to the city to learn a craft from his village home, and he lived there with a master Skinner who was to train him. The rhythms of urban life begin to inform the story here, and with them, of course, the intimations of danger. For Thomas tells us, and how could he know, that the boy frequented Jewish homes, where he was employed in mending expensive leather and fur garments. Then, while he was living in Norwich, the Jews who dwelt there at the time chose him above all other skinners for the repair of mantles, furs, and other things of this kind, which they either had as surety, so as a pawn, or which they themselves used. For indeed they considered him highly suitable, either because they saw him as simple and skillful, or because, led by miserliness, they reckoned they could pay him a lower wage. But I think it is more likely that by the wish of divine providence he was already destined centuries ago for martyrdom, and so was drawn to it step by degrees. And so he was chosen by the Jews as less wise and more fitting to be mocked and sacrificed, in disgrace of the Lord's passion. So this is a sort of tricky idea here, that on the one hand he's trying to develop a background for the Jewish guilt. On the other hand, Thomas is all saying, but of course this is all foreseen and foretold. Into the life of the boy William now intruded the Jewish plot, and it was introduced through the device of a convert. So converts often appear in our stories as in stories about relations between Jews and Christians, particularly ones where the Jews ultimately desecrate something precious to Christians, because how would they have access to it, be it a holy vessel or be it the Eucharist, the consecrated Eucharist just mentioned, or indeed a Christian boy. So the convert is often a sort of way of knowing more or mediating information between these two communities. And so Thomas also recounts that we have indeed learned from some Jews who later converted truly to the Christian faith, that at that time they intended to do that very thing to a Christian, and in order to complete their plan of spite, they chose in advance at the beginning of Lent the boy William, who was 12 years old at the time and innocent indeed. Holy Week, leading up to Easter, was also Passover that year, as so often they coincide, and it was a fitting setting for a latter-day Passion. But how might the boy be taken away by the Jews during these days of intense family and parish worship? The boy would surely be at home, in the country, with his mother, who we know by now, we are told, that she had been widowed. Here an elaborate conspiracy is imputed to the Norwich Jews, whereby one of their number pretended to be a representative of the Archdeacon of Norwich, a cook who needed help in the kitchens over the busy holiday weekend and wanted to hire the boy to provide such help. The boy was delighted, apparently, to be chosen for the job, but his mother had to be persuaded. So they go together to approach Mum. Promising much, to be sure, the son of perdition is, of course, the man who is pretending to be hiring the boy, but in fact is an emissary of the Jews. The son of perdition easily enticed the childish mind with his empty promises, but at first he could in no way extract the mother's approval in the matter. The innocent boy agreed to the insistent traitor, but the mother resisted, her gut feeling warning her, fearing for her son with the maternal instinct. Now the traitor, and then the mother. He begs, and she refuses. Sort of tug of war. He begs in order to destroy the boy. She refuses, lest she may lose him. He claims to be the archdeacon's cook, but she does not trust him at all. Between him and her, as between a sheep and a wolf, who first would you think the strongest in the fight over the third? The third was in the middle, was the boy, the lamb. The lamb was in the middle, the sheep on one side and the wolf on the other. The wolf stands in order to tear and devour. The sheep stands forth to rescue and save. But because the boy was lured, you see there, there's wonderful images from vestries from the Middle Ages, from about that time, a little bit later, of this constant anxiety about the wolf and the sheepfold. But because the boy was lured, he favored one of them and repeatedly begged and argued and wanted his mother to let him go. And so ultimately she does. So there's another commonplace of popular culture here, of course, which is a woman's fickleness, the ease by which she can be swayed. And he also added a few coins to please her for good measure. So the boy is now with him, in the hands of those planning the crime. First, they treated him well, giving the unsuspecting boy food to eat. But next, and here is the most graphic invention of all, this is the core of the text, this is the imagined, which of course did not happen, but also, even in Thomas's terms, could not have been seen. Here is the latter-day passion, which is the boy's martyrdom. Then the Jews received the boy kindly, like an innocent lamb led to the slaughter. So here are also all the biblical echoes. And he was ignorant of what business was being prepared for him, and he was kept until the morrow. And so, following daybreak, which was their Pascha, that is the Jewish Passover that year, after the appropriate chants of the day were finished in the synagogue, the leaders of the Jews met in the house of the aforementioned Jew, and while the boy William was eating, fearing no treachery, they suddenly seized him and humiliated him in various wretched ways. For some of them held him from behind, others inserted into his open mouth a torture instrument known in English as a teasel, and fixed it with straps either side of his jaws to the back of his neck, where they made a very tight knot. Next they took a short rope, about as thick as a little finger, and made 3 knots in places marked on it, and encircled that innocent head from forehead to back. In the center of the forehead they pressed a knot, as they did in each temple. Both sides of the head were tied to the back extremely tightly, and there a firm knot was made. The ends of the rope were then tied around the neck and around under the chin, and there this unheard of type of torture was completed in a 5th knot. And it is unheard of. I mean, I've spoken to people who know about law and about torture and archaeology and how bodies are found and whatnot. No one's ever heard about this form of torture with knots. This story had never been told before, and yet several of its elements are familiar. The setting of Holy Week, 5 offending painful wounds, the innocent led to the slaughter, the conspiracy of Jews, the wounding which followed with sharp metal instruments, and the final hanging between the doorposts of the Jewish house. Historic time and the present met in Norwich, the scriptural Jews and the Jew next door, the biblical instruments of torture and the familiar instrument of the local cloth trade. So that's the teasel, the plant, and that is the sort of man-made teasel which is used to pick out impurities, sort of to finish off cloth, really, to remove sort of impurities and stuff that is sticking out. The local and domestic elements of the child murder narrative are set within a sophisticated frame of theological argument, of which the monk Thomas of Monmouth seems to have been informed. In answer to the objections raised by fellow monks when Thomas sought to have the boy treated as a martyr, with a cult in the cathedral, which is what he was trying to promote from 1150, he brought the following evidence. Theobald, a person who was once a Jew and later one of our monks, that is a convert, told us that Jews could not achieve their freedom nor ever return to the lands of their fathers without the shedding of human blood. Hence it was decided by them a long time ago that every year, to the shame and affront of Christ, a Christian somewhere on earth be sacrificed to the highest God. And so they take revenge for the injuries of him whose death is the reason for their exclusion from their fatherland. Leaders and rabbis of the Jews who dwell in Spain at Narbonne, which is southern France as we call it today, meet together annually and cast lots of all the regions where Jews live. Whichever region was chosen by lot, its capital city had to apply that lot then to the other cities and towns, and the one whose name came up will carry out the business, as decreed. In that year, however, when the glorious martyr of God, William, was killed, it so happened that the lot fell on the men of Norwich. Now, this Narbonne-based conspiracy had only very, very recently been articulated by a very important theologian and abbot of the Order of Cluny, Peter the Venerable. Now, Peter visited England twice in the 1140s, and he had some associations with Norwich and Norfolk. Thomas may have heard it told. It's impossible to trace the sort of precocious absorption of this new idea, but it's clearly there, and it cites very clearly this idea with great detail that Peter the Venerable had put forth in one of his polemical texts very recently. But it's still a remarkable adaptation of a high-level theological, polemical idea to the local setting of Norwich. Those who were in the following decades to visit the shrine in search of cures did not require so robust a framing story and justification. Their tales of chronic illness and long-suffering children led them to the promise that was the new boy martyr and his health-giving tomb, and they provide the material for over 100 miracle tales embedded in our text. But there were parties in the priory, as I mentioned, for whom more sophisticated arguments had to be mustered, and so they were. And so once the established story of William's life and death, Thomas of Monmouth's work, once he established the story, so there's almost like the first part, maybe the first third of the text is almost like a freestanding hagiographical account that starts, as you heard, before the boy's birth, his childhood, his working life, and then his death. But Thomas of Monmouth continued to work, and indeed he even says he was the secretarius, he was the secretary, as it were, of this martyr. He was the go-to person for everything related to the emergent cult, any cures or visions or invocations of William from afar that resulted in relief, any offerings of gifts, and so the work continued. From the heyday of the 1150s and the flurry of work to establish the story itself, until the last entry that is datable towards the end of the book, and that's around 1172, maybe the year of Thomas's death. Fake news such as this, new narrative made of old, must always be made to seem natural and mundane, and they have to carry these stories the punch of indignation and moral purpose. All this Thomas of Monmouth understood well. So let's just for a moment revisit Norwich Cathedral before we go on to talk about how the narrative spread way beyond. So the cathedral was a new arrival too, having been built at the creation of Norwich Diocese in the 1090s. So this is just a generation after the Norman Conquest, and it's a late and new cathedral. It was a magnificent edifice, of course you know, and I'll just show you another picture there, headed by an active first bishop, Herbert of Losinga, a powerful prelate involved in royal diplomacy, a great builder, and a zealous nurturer of the cathedral and its rites. Dedicated to the Holy Trinity, it was a powerful presence in the city, as we saw on that map, with its own precinct and hence its own jurisdiction, and estates throughout Norfolk and bits of Suffolk. But it was not an ancient institution. It was not associated with a particularly lively and long-standing cult of any saint or martyr, unlike, for example, Bury St. Edmunds, not far from it, with its extraordinary martyrs cult. So while we must acknowledge the underlying anti-Jewish feeling which Thomas mobilized and much enhanced, his work was probably motivated by the desire to magnify Norwich Cathedral Priory as a new worthy link in the chain of Christian history. This history was always unfolding, and at its heart was a polemical relationship with Judaism, past and now present. To say that the fake news of William of Norwich's martyrdom sought to magnify a young cathedral and give prominence within it to a recently arrived monk, himself Thomas of Monmouth, should not diminish in our minds the repercussions the tale had for Jews in future generations. Of course, the Jews of Norwich, we have no reason to think that anything ever happened to them, as I explained. But the repercussions were there, and I'll explain. And nor should its falsity deflect our attention from the death. Of course, there was a death at the heart of this thing. There was a child whose body who first disappeared and then whose body was found. And that, too, should attract our attention. But like all fake news, there is at its root a motivating mix of powerful emotions and purpose. The death of a child can excite such feeling, and a creative mind, attuned to the conventions and possibilities of popular culture and local habits, can build upon these by the creation of a new, powerful narrative, which for some becomes unassailable truth. Villagers from all around North Norfolk and some further afield were indeed drawn into the circle of miracle reportage. A typical miracle began with a person's illness or disability, maybe long suffering and persistent, perhaps an incapacity since birth, like deafness or muteness. Next, the attempt to seek cure from doctors often is described, and lots of money is spent, but to no avail. A consultation with family follows usually in these accounts, and the advice to try the praying to a saint, and in the end, to that new saint, slightly untested, but still worth a try, the boy martyr William. The most common mode of engagement with was the preparation of a candle, that is, to make an offering, like a candle. Sometimes the length of the actual person, that is, the wick would be the length of the actual person, or the length of the limb which was being treated, leading then the happy person, once cured, to go to Norwich perhaps and actually deliver it themselves to the cathedral, to the shrine, to Thomas. So we have quite a few descriptions of that happening. Representing emotion is important to Thomas of Monmouth's work in several ways. There's a lot of sort of guiding emotions. There's, first of all, the indignation, which permeates his discussion about the Jews who went unpunished and the boy unnoticed for so many years until he turned up. Then there's the hatred. A really bad feeling is imputed to the Jews. The Jews are full of hate. And then there's the jealousy and the pettiness that are attributed to anyone, to all those who did not accept just wholeheartedly the new cult. And then there's a sort of suffering unto despair for those seeking cure, and then the joy and gratitude they felt once they were cured. Although the rhetorical tradition guides Thomas towards a sort of forensic oratory, constantly proving and bringing evidence, the bulk of his work tends towards proof and persuasion through sharing emotional worlds with others. What was the effect, then, of this unique invented narrative? How indeed might we know? Well, there's no real documentary evidence to suggest that anything happened, neither in Latin nor in Hebrew, to the Jews of Norwich, as I said. Thomas claimed that this was due to the protection awarded to them by a corrupt sheriff, and by implication, through his inaction, by an indifferent bishop. Thomas's work, which began 6 years after the event, established a modest cult then in the cathedral, with its own feast day, and we have from the 13th century also a liturgy for that day. Accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries show that only small offerings and limited offerings were made at the shrine. The legacy of Thomas's work was not so much in its local durability as a persistent big cult, but rather in its narrative force, which spread beyond Norwich and Norfolk. The books of miracles reveal some of the trails by which news of William's cult may have travelled beyond Norwich. It is notable that in the later decades of the 12th century, a number of cases seem to retell or enact the child murder accusation, though, like in Norwich, with little immediate success. In some cases, there wasn't even a body of a child, just a rumour of a child disappeared. So the Benedictine houses of Bury St. Edmunds, the neighbouring house in Suffolk, and Pershore in Worcestershire, for example, are attested in the text. So we know that there were people from these places who had been then left and reported cures after their return. So there's a sort of network. of Benedictine monastic houses where there's a circulation, sufficient amount of circulation of people who might bear the story beyond Norfolk and beyond Norwich and Norfolk. At St. Peter's Abbey in Gloucester, an accusation was made when young Harold disappeared, and this may have been occasioned by the link to Norwich that this abbey had as patrons of the wealthy church of St. Peter Mancroft in the city's marketplace, which may have led to the visits by members from the house in Gloucester or their servants to the city in the course of business, and thus hearing about the cult. A testimonial letter from a monk of Pershore in Worcestershire is one of the latest entries in the book, with evidence of a miracle attesting to William's fame and efficacy even further west in England. All these instances follow from dissemination within the Benedictine network of monastic houses, and within a broader Anglo-Norman realm, both sides of the Channel. When the Norman monk Robert of Torigny, who died in 1186, abbot of Mont-Saint-Michel and third continuator of the Chronicle of the Dukes of Normandy, so a very well-informed individual, reported the burning of Jews in Blois, the city of Blois, in 1171 for alleged child murder. He also mentioned the cases of Norwich and Gloucester as forerunners that already created a pattern. Yet we can also detect the spread of the tale into another network of communication, and this is what I discovered, and thanks for coming, and I know you have to go. Into another network of communication, and that is of a different monastic order. It might not be familiar to all of you, the Cistercian Order, and this is really important because the Cistercian Order is very, very recent. It was only created literally in the last years of the 11th century. It's the hot, fashionable order of the 12th century, and it's an order that insisted on a lot of coming and going in annual gatherings of representatives of all its houses. So within the Cistercian Order, there's a tremendous amount of news flow and communication. So once we can see it in one house, we can expect that a certain story would become known very quickly. It was this centralizing sort of order that expected all its daughter institutions to come close frequently and thus to share information. And I've been able to establish through the examination of the paleography, that is the handwriting, as well as the codicology, the putting together of the book itself, and other textual analyses, that the sole surviving manuscript was in fact produced in a Cistercian monastery not far away from Norwich, in Sibton, in Suffolk. And I have a picture of it. This, of course, was ruined at the Reformation. This is interesting in itself, since it's a sort of jump then from the Benedictine to the now very fashionable Cistercian milieu. But the mystery of how that happened is solved once we find out, or once we acknowledge, that Sibton was founded in 1150 by no other than the executor and brother, and indeed heir, as Sheriff of Norfolk, of John of Cheney, who is the man who is acting in our case. So our man, John of Cheney, who died in 1147, that is a few years after the events where he was accused of protecting the Jews, we are told by Thomas of Monmouth that he died a terrible death by sort of anal flux of blood, and that he deserved it because of the way he had protected the Jews. There are layers of layers there that we could unpick, but what's interesting is that his will wished his wealth to be used for the foundation of a Cistercian house by his brother or by his executors, and that is just typical because the Cistercian order is very popular at this time. So his brother does indeed found the house, and the manuscript is from that house. So you have to wonder now why an account of this would find its way to an institution associated then with one of the great actors in this story, but also one who's represented rather negatively within the text. I don't have an answer to that. I can only think that it was a text that interested people in the region. So what's important for our purposes, though, that entering into the Cistercian circle helps us understand how the story indeed spread across the Channel and beyond in Europe. We also witness that some Cistercian chroniclers in the early 13th century, like Helenand of Fradmont, in his chronicle, accounts under the year 1146, well, what's 2 years, 1146 accounts, tells the story of what has happened. So clearly the Cistercian network is one that allows the story to be told and to be spread. And if that is the case, that the story became known in England and beyond, it is clear also that by 1255 it was known in Lincoln. Because when a boy disappeared in Lincoln, and his body had not yet been found, nonetheless there rallied around the mother a number of preachers as well as royal officials who supported her claim, or who helped her claim that it was the Jews. And here, 111 years after the Norwich case, it is not that the Jews get protected and nothing happens. It is actually violent, with the execution of one Jew locally and 18 others who were taken to the Tower of London. So it's a very, very different story, because by mid-13th century England, we're talking about Henry III's England, we're talking about an England where a particular sort of pact between Christianity or Christian sort of fervor, a new type of very exciting, devotionally driven religion is developed by now by the friars, 2 generations particularly of the Franciscans in England, and a king that is constantly promoting the cause of Jewish conversion, even as he also limits very harshly the remit of work and public activity that Jews can hold. So it all comes together. So 111 years after Norwich, an accusation like this is much more falls on a very different type of ground than it did in the mid-12th century. And of course the Jews are kicked out of England in 1290, but nonetheless another century, and a century after that, Geoffrey Chaucer in his Prioress's Tale is able to put in the mouth of the prioress a really blood-curdling story about Jews killing a Christian boy in some city in Asia, as it is put, but nonetheless to finish the story with an invocation that turns to, "O young Hugh of Lincoln, slain also with cursed Jews, as it is notable, as it is well known." So he can assume that by the late 14th century, a mention of Hugh of Lincoln and this sort of story would not go without people picking up on it and enjoying it as part of the narrative. So the emergence of a narrative was not a sufficient condition for its enactment, but its placement among narratives that were now alive and available allowed it to be activated in different contexts, be they poetical or be they social contexts like the one in Lincoln. Most religious circulated through channels bound variously by religious order, language, region, and diocese. Nor did all narratives, even those like ours, cast in a well-established genre, that is, authoritative hagiography and miracle accounts, spur people to action. They could be read as oddities, they could be read as exempla to spice up a sermon. So the fact that a story has come into the world doesn't mean that it's an efficacious story, but it always has potential. Enactments of child murder accusations against Jews were relatively rare throughout the Middle Ages and indeed later. And they often failed to meet the legal criteria or fit the policy frameworks of European rulers, and thus were just dropped, really. Over the later medieval centuries, we observe more and more cases in which it is just so. For a story to animate a local accusation, for narrative to turn into social drama, several criteria had to be met. It had to fit the local circumstances and be painted in local color, places, names, material, artifacts like the teasel from Norwich. And there has to be institutional and political willingness to allow this sort of thing to unfold. Towards the later Middle Ages, then, we note a resurgence of an interest in William of Norwich himself, in his city, and slightly beyond it. There was a taste in Norfolk for a number of 5 or 6 cases where when screens were painted with series of martyrs, so amongst the great martyrs of early Christianity, like Agatha, will be placed our boy William. Another one over there, alongside Lucy, our William. And this is probably associated with the fact that in the late 14th century, the local guild of skinners adopted him as their patron, so there's a sort of resurgence, maybe of familiarity with him. It is also striking that with the development of mechanical reproduction, such as woodcuts, news could spread more quickly, and most notably in the case of the child murder accusation that occurred in the Alpine city of Trent in 1475, which was treated as an inquisitorial trial, that this broadsheet was produced immediately, and there was text associated with this as well. And you see it's hand-painted there. It's really very beautiful, and it tells about not just one Jew, but many Jews, including a woman, abusing the child and also abusing its genitals and collecting the blood. So the story has become much more elaborate than it had been in 12th century Norwich by now, and it will reach audiences far more quickly because of the technological possibilities. And in the course of the 16th century, another twist, as polemical activity encouraged new compilations and collections of lives of saints and martyrs, particularly, obviously, Catholic saints and martyrs in the face of the onslaught by Protestants and the derision that was poured upon the whole enterprise of cults and saints. There's a lot of collections of, as it were, books that are literally just collections and miscellanies of trying to show how abundant and rich and interesting is the tradition of hagiography. And occasionally we get William of Norwich inserted in unexpected European contexts, and you see the images it's a sort of generic crucifixion there. By tracing the making of a new anti-Jewish narrative, and here I finish, by a single historical agent, Thomas of Monmouth, and within the context of 12th century life in the city of Norwich, I hope then that we have traced its dual roots in Christian learned culture and in local sensibilities. I trust that by doing so we've also learned, I think, a sort of more general lesson about the power of narrative, its tentativeness, but also its resilience. And I also think it's interesting that a project that started because of my own sympathies to the whole issue of sort of the history of the Jews, and a text that had such, obviously such resonances, the first of the series of these narratives. What's been interesting is that, as so often the case, if you trace stories about Jews, you actually find out far more about Christians. Thank you very much.